Opponents ready?
Yeah.
Yes.
Order. Judges. Rather than I negate the result, the United States federal government should enforce antitrust regulations on technology giants. Contention 1 are startups. The FTC is looking to anti-competitive activity in tech. Nats19 finds that the Federal Trade Commission will monitor the tech industry for anti-competitive activity, which includes reviewing industry mergers, both those slated to take place as well as those who have already been completed. This is an extremely relevant aspect of antitrust, as Tepper 18 finds that big companies have bought more than 500 other companies in the past decade. Ultimately, preventing acquisitions and mergers by big technology hurts tech startups in two ways. The first is through venture capital. As Nats19 writes, that interest from existing platforms must exist for venture capitalists to even fund startups in the first place. Market power of platforms encourage venture capital funding, accelerating innovation. McCardle 19 qualifies this as venture capitalists who fund startups want to recoup their investments by selling out to big tech. The issue is that any antitrust movement would kill the financing startup process. The second warrant is provided by Rogan 19, who says that big tech companies provide a safety blanket and infrastructure for startups to innovate more heavily, create new products, and market those products as well. The impact is job preservation, as economist Enrico Moretti estimates that technology-based startups have a job multiplier of 5. For every direct job created by tech, 5 additional jobs are created elsewhere relative to every other form of startup. A Massachusetts Biotechnology Council paper estimates that each new biotech job created around Boston generated 5 other indirect jobs in the region. Ultimately, this is important as 64% of all job creation from 1966 to 2011 was associated with small startup companies. Contention 2 is financial technology, fintech for short. Fintech is defined by Kagan 19, says that fintech is used to describe new technology that seeks to improve and automate the delivery and use of financial services. Big tech is infiltrating the finance market now, as Murphy 19 finds that big tech strategies to offer a seamless digital financial service experience tied to their core platforms. That's a really good thing, because it reduces financial exclusion. As Murphy 19 continues, banking with big tech has the potential to increase financial inclusion, as 1.7 billion adults globally still lack a bank or mobile money account. Many of these excluded citizens lack a credit history or proximity to a brick-and-mortar bank branch, but they do own mobile phones and access to the internet. The emergence of digital financial services has increased financial inclusion by lessening consumers' reliance on bank branches. Digital finance has made banking services available to consumers in places where banks have little to no physical presence. And despite growing unease over how Silicon Valley uses personal data, many consumers still indicate that they are very open to banking with big tech. The issue is that financial tech relies on big data collection in two ways. The first is for the revenue, as Murphy 19 continues, and big tech's value proposition lies within its ability to provide affordable financial services tailored to its customers. Big tech is able to offer its services by offsetting its costs with selling user data. The second way that fintech relies on data collection is through competition, as Co18 finds that fintech companies focus on creating personalized financial services that meet the very specific demands of the final consumer. That's where big data comes into discussion. Big data contributes to catering these companies with valuable information in terms of consumer needs and expectations. The biggest issue, though, is that antitrust enforcement hurts this data collection, as Alexis 19 finds that U.S. antitrust regulators scrutinize tech companies' data practices, acknowledging their concerns that consumer information will increase market power. The FTC will monitor tech industry competition, and they plan to incorporate data collection and privacy as the main variables into their antitrust oversight campaign. Ultimately, the impact of bank accessibility through big technology is fighting the cycle of poverty, as Yalvaron 15 finds that financial exclusion is a hardship on 88 million Americans who are unbanked or underbanked. For the most part, these families have no savings and access to only high-cost credit. Financial exclusion significantly increases the risk of poverty, as many of these families have very low emergency funds. But we can reduce the number of unbanked and underbanked families far below 28% in the status quo. News 17 finds that unbanked individuals cost an average individual with a full-time job up to $40,000 over the course of his or her lifetime. This could amount to the difference between food security and food insecurity. If you want to save startups and you want to fight the cycle of poverty, negate.
Can we see the card that says fintech ends if we prosecute?
It's just
Yeah, whatever they have on it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, this is like the antitrust.
yeah.
Sure, it just says like
antitrust violation.
antitrust is going to stop it.
It's highlighted.
All right. Is everyone ready?
You want me to give it back right now?
Is it cool if you read through it?
We can give it back right now.
Oh,
That's
okay,
good.
never mind.
Wait, so did y'all take?
We can take, it was like 5 seconds. Or,
Oh yeah, you can call it
sure,
5 seconds.
seconds.
Whatever.
All right. Everyone ready? Okay. We affirm our sole contention concerns the viability of scale-ups. Since the 1980s, the rate of successful startups in the U.S. has slowed dramatically. Jonathan Tepper of UNC in 2018 writes that changes to antitrust enforcement under the Reagan administration facilitated the growth of big businesses, consequently suppressing emerging startups. This lack of antitrust enforcement has persisted, as Buck of the New York Times in 2019 confirms that President Trump's antitrust chief is still hindering the ability of the federal government to tame the power of tech giants. Large tech firms have created copycat products, undercut prices, and illegally purchased companies to eliminate competition with no consequence. Hubbard of CNN Business in 2019 quantifies that tech giants have grown through hundreds of these illegal dealings that violate antitrust laws, causing small tech firms to fall into dangerous territory with no protection whatsoever. Fortunately, enforcing antitrust regulations would bring violations to the courts. Professor Randolph McAfee of Caltech writes in 2004 that tech giants would offer hefty financial settlements as reparation for violating antitrust law. There are two reasons that tech giants would immediately choose to settle when faced with antitrust lawsuits. The first is maintaining investor confidence. Bidlingmeyer of the Cato Institute in 2001 explains that unsettled antitrust cases increase uncertainty and lower expected financial returns for investors. The uncertainty of legal rulings and the threat of a broken company spooks investors, causing them to pull out. Thus, nearly every antitrust case is settled by large companies before litigation harms their bottom line. David Straitfield of the New York Times in 2014 confirms that recent investigation of tech giants such as Apple and Intel resulted in immediate settlements instead of lengthy litigation, as defendants knew the cost of uncertainty that ongoing litigation brought would be too risky. Second is preserving political influence. As most industries, technology giants have an agenda to push through Congress. John Taplin of The Guardian in 2019 writes that big tech has spent millions in Congress to advance their agenda, retaining immense political influence. The only blunder to big tech's influence in Congress is fighting the FTC's antitrust enforcement. Rom of Politico writes in 2015 that empirically companies such as Apple, Amazon, and Google failed to advance their political priorities in Congress after fighting the FTC on its investigations. For these two reasons, Bakur from the University of Texas in 2004 writes that antitrust litigation against tech giants has been proven to be highly successful in retaining financial settlements when enforced. Settlements in turn allow small businesses to become safe destinations for domestic investment. Empirically, this is true, as Mike Swift of Stanford in 2019 analyzes the case of Apple v. Qualcomm, finding that after reaching a settlement, Qualcomm stock rose by 23%. This investment allows startups to turn into scale-ups. As Mansfield of Small Business Trends in 2019 highlights, that in the status quo, 82% of startups fail to become scale-ups in the status quo because they fail to retain capital. There are two impacts. The first impact is creating jobs. Wu of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation in 2017 further finds that tech startups which succeed in scaling up can effectively create over 100,000 high-paying jobs annually. The Brookings Institution in 2015 further terminalizes that every single job created in the tech sector creates 3 jobs in other sectors of the economy. The second impact is driving artificial intelligence. Scale-up firms are the driving force behind AI. Siemens of Harvard in 2018 writes that half of AI startups sell to mid-sized scale-up firms. By preventing the deterrence of scale-up firms, artificial intelligence would be streamlined. The McKinsey Global Institute in 2018 writes that AI has the potential to deliver additional global economic activity, around $13 trillion. Investing in startups to advance into mid-range firms delivers the potential. Audriel of Forbes in 2018 concludes that absent any action, the number of tech giants will shrink by 57%. Because Jackson and I believe that antitrust laws are not meant to destroy big businesses, but instead bolster small startups, we are very proud to affirm. Yeah. Oh, you want to take prep for a second?
Yeah, just take
We'll take prep 1 sec. Yeah, okay. So 10 seconds, so 5.
Ross?
Yes.
Okay. How do you solve for predatory practices?
Predatory practices?
Yeah.
So we would say that our argument isn't that companies are going to stop violating antitrust. Our case is that when they violate antitrust laws, they're brought to courts. Here's the link chain. When the Department of Justice litigates against large tech companies,
I was just asking, it's just solvency, right? So you state that predatory practices are an issue. How do you solve for these in the affirmative?
Right. We have two different interpretations of solvency. Your solvency is that we need to break up big companies. Our solvency is that we need to pay financial reparations through settlements through small businesses, because that's what's empirically happened. And Jackson will get into this more in his speech. Could I ask you a question now?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so let's talk about fintech.
Yeah.
Why do companies invest in fintech right now?
Companies as in who?
As in big tech companies. Why do they
Yeah.
produce fintech?
Yeah. Yeah, so big technologies see that fintech is especially lucrative right now. But what they're also seeing is that there's a potential to expand their network and to be able to benefit other consumers at the same time.
Sure. So I'm just trying to understand.
Sure.
So when they can't consolidate data, that is when they stop fintech. Right? Your link is
data collection. Yeah.
Okay, sure.
Okay. So let's talk about this like court violation thing, right?
Yeah.
So you give us an example of Apple v. Qualcomm, right?
Sure.
In 1982, whenever the United States enforced antitrust legislation on Microsoft, Microsoft took them to court, right? And Microsoft was found to be innocent of like these things, right? So if found to be innocent, what's going to happen to all of these like companies that go to lawsuits?
Sure. So the time frame is really important here because around 1982, IBM was also sued for an antitrust lawsuit. What happened to IBM was devastating. Their entire company was destroyed. That's why in recent years, the most recent evidence that we give you of Apple and Microsoft post 2000 do not follow through on litigation. That's why our warrants say that they've learned from their mistakes and the lengthy litigation is too costly, which is why now they settle.
Yeah, really quickly on that. So like the internal warrant to that is like spooking investor confidence, correct?
Yep.
Okay. So if a big company goes to like gets taken under a lawsuit, right?
Yep.
And they go for a settlement, that like is indirectly admitting some form of guilt, right?
Yeah, but it is, yeah, exactly.
Right, so like wouldn't that also like spook investor confidence if they know that their company is doing something wrong insofar as the government has to come after them?
Absolutely not. The Cato Institute even outlines that the reason that, like we can even give you an Apple's patent lawyer's take on this. He says that when Apple was faced with antitrust, it is far more costly to investors to have litigation going on than to just settle because litigants
So then why did Microsoft go to litigation?
Microsoft settled the case. In 2001, your 1982 example faces our narrative. IBM and Microsoft, first when faced with antitrust, fought against it, failed, and now they realize that litigation is a lot easier. You may be right that Microsoft was innocent, but the amount of investors they lost in that time frame was far more damaging to their company than back in 2001 when they settled. Could I ask you a question now? Sure. So let's talk about your startup's contention, right?
Yeah.
So right now, you say that there's job prevention happening. If we can prove that startups are being harmed in the status quo, don't we prove that there's no inherency on this argument?
Well, we tell you that tech startups are actually getting a lot of venture capital funding, and I'm glad you brought that up because your evidence isn't specific to tech startups. It's talking about the startup economy in general.
Sorry, can we just grab one more card that says that venture capital will decrease if we stop mergers? That's their
There's the first link.
intention one.
Yeah.
First link on C1.
Yeah, they're gonna collapse.
Yeah, there are 2 warrants, 3 cards. All 3 are there.
Cool.
Starting now.
Biology.
Alright, we'll start there.
Alright, that's 30 you've already used. So 40 total.
Okay. We'll be running some prep time starting now. Okay, stop running. 18 use.
The order's going to be an overview, then down their case. I'll be completing our arguments as we go. Yeah, across the board.
Where do you want me to flow the overview?
Yeah.
The overview will be on their side.
Okay. Okay.
Yep. Okay. Everybody ready? It's important to first understand the historical patterns that antitrust regulations follow. When you're 18, finds that over the last 40 years, antitrust regulations have been used during 2 big periods, so the 60s and the 80s. But the issue is that the predatory practices that they are talking about existed before and after it. It gives 2 runs. First is because we live in a capitalist society that allows just simply bigger companies to abuse smaller companies despite antitrust regulations. And the second is because even empirically in other industries it hasn't worked. It's important to understand that the problems that they're talking about in terms of buying these other companies, or even just in terms terms of pricing out of the market are institutional problems with the capitalist market. It is not antitrust regulations. If antitrust regulations have never solved, they won't solve now, they won't solve then. Even in other industries, Westlaw 18 finds that all markets since 1997 have seen usually 4 major firms come up to the top of the marketplace and have a majority of monopoly. And antitrust regulations exist in every one of those other industries, but we still see the predatory practices. So it's important to understand they are not going to solve. This is really important because any chance that there is a disadvantage means that you're going to be voting neg because empirics show that it doesn't work. But now let's go on to their case. We control the internal link to startups because biz community turns this when he finds that it's good when big tech companies buy out startups because when they are able to, these startups release their technology because they have to survive in the market. What we basically say is that when these big tech companies buy them up, they allow them to eventually cultivate their innovation and release it on time. For example, when Apple came out with the Macintosh, they waited several years because they realized that consumers weren't ready for the market because they didn't have the technical skills yet. But they were supported by other companies. But when they don't have these other companies to support them, they release it too early. That's important because the innovation doesn't actually help the market or help jobs. But then we're going to turn it again because Con and 18 finds that antitrust regulations, when they are forced on big tech companies, often trickle down to medium and small companies. That's important because these companies won't have the capital nor they have the influence to fight off these regulations, thus making it a lot harder for startups. But then our whole first contention completely turns theirs because venture capital is a prerequisite to any of their impacts on startups because we tell you they need venture capital to get off the ground in the first place. But they won't provide that venture capital funding if they don't have the potential for profit. These investors understand that investing in every tech startup comes with a certain risk regardless of the competitive marketplace. But they aren't willing to take that risk if they don't have the potential to make profit. We need to remove that by disallowing these big tech companies to buy them up. That means that they won't get venture capital. That's going to turn their impacts. But now, let's talk about these big companies, right? They try and tell you that these companies are more likely to settle. But the issue is that Rosenberg 19 finds that when Microsoft was investigated, they lost billions of dollars in federal court and they caused less innovation. Now, they try and tell you that that is going to change when you affirm today. But we're telling you, first example, Sprint and T-Mobile just last month tried to merger. And so now they're in a federal lawsuit investigation over the merger. We're seeing that right now, when antitrust regulations are actually being used on tech, investigations are still happening. They're not likely to settle. This is also important because they give you the evidence that turns their own. Because they tell you that these companies have a lot of influence. So why wouldn't they use that influence in an investigation and fight off a lawsuit so they wouldn't come off as their investors are doing bad? You can test that the fact that they're taking a fine in the first place means that these investors are going to get scared. They give you the internal link that turns their own argument. But then, this is really important because Nats19 finds that larger companies invest 6 times more in research and development and their R&D is 13% more productive. We would contend that because of the biz community card, the big companies control the internal link to small companies. Insofar as they are the ones that are actually helping invest in these small companies, through the road card that we review in case in biz community, the big companies' turn is going to come first. But then, this is really important because insofar as they have no uniqueness, we would contend that any risk of any one of these disadvantages that we've read or that we've read in the case is going to turn. But now let's talk about financial tech. Let me explain this. What we were saying is that big tech is going to the financial tech industry, and that's really good. Smaller startups in that industry are getting bought out by banks, but big tech has the ability to fight that off. That is good because they're getting people bank accounts in other countries, and that is really important to reduce the cycle of poverty. So if you want to help startups, if you want to help big companies, and you want to help poverty, you're going to vote for negation.
Yeah, we'll start prep right now.
Yeah, we'll stop there.
Okay, 7 more.
Okay, can I get the...
Yep.
Right, it's going to start off with their overview and then responding to their attacks, and then we'll flip over, attack their case.
So overview, front lines, neg.
Yep.
Exactly. Everyone ready?
Yep.
All right. They give you this overview about historical patterns and how in the 60s and 80s there was antitrust legislation, there's still predatory practices. What they miss is that our link is far more nuanced. They're just assuming that we're only ending predatory practices. What we tell you is that's not true. What we're doing is getting these companies settlements. When they get these settlements, they become a safe haven for investment, and when they get this investment, they have the money to succeed. We tell you this with inherency when we say that 82% of companies fail not because of predatory practices, but because they don't have the capital to succeed. That's the issue that we're solving for, that's non-responsive. But moreover, don't allow them to pigeonhole this debate to the 60s and 80s. We give you far more recent examples. And as Arunab tells you, big tech companies have learned how to litigate and win in courts. They do it through settlements. Let's get into their specific attacks. First, they say that big tech is good for small tech because they give them the capital to innovate. Respond to this with Cunningham in 2018. It says that 94% of mergers are not anti-competitive and would not be stopped. The 6% that are anti-competitive or are killer mergers would be stopped. Those are things like Google buying out 9 robotics companies and firing all of their top researchers. That's the difference. We allow the innovative ones to continue. We stop the non-innovative ones. That's why you can turn their contention. Then the second thing they say is that VC is a prerequisite. We'll get on that case. We'll get on their case, but that's non-responsive. We say that investment will decrease for big companies when they have to face lengthy litigation. That's proven by Apple and Intel. Then they say that in the example of Microsoft, they lost investment after the case, after they settled. That's not true. The very next year, they had record levels of growth. We would argue that this is far more important. In the long term, Microsoft bounced back. There was no actual hurting their company. That's why you can extend the Bitling-Meyer and 01 card. It says that when companies face lengthy litigation, it ultimately hurts their bottom line. They're companies. They're trying to make money, so they settle right out of it. At that point, they talk about investigation influence and how they could circumvent, so they fight. You can turn this against them though. The reason that the federal government is such a good actor, it's not working right now because only private companies can sue. When the federal government uniquely enforces, it allows private companies to realize that the federal government is on their side. That's what McAfee tells you. It says that there will be a swarm of private companies suing big companies now that they have the backing of the federal government. That gives us access to the Swift in 2019 evidence, which says that when companies are able to settle these cases because they have the backing of the federal government, they get a huge influx of capital. Qualcomm's stock rose 23%. That gives us finally access to the AI impact, which they don't contest. It can add $13 trillion to the economy. Onto their case. Start off with an observation of our own. The thesis of our case is not hurting big businesses, but instead bolstering small startups. You buy this interpretation of not hurting big businesses for 4 reasons. First, the FTC on their website calls this enforcement. They say that this is the best way of enforcement. They realize the harms of hurting big tech. They say we just need to focus on helping small ones. The second, though, the warranting that we give you in case. We give you very good reason why big tech also wants to comply to the FTC. The third reason, the McAfee evidence, and especially the example of Microsoft. Microsoft bounced back, and they're one of the tech giants that we're talking about today, even after their antitrust litigation. And fourth and finally, they talk about historical precedent and then don't give you a single empiric in their case. That's ridiculous. We would argue that history is on our side for this debate. At the point where we win this observation, their case doesn't exist. If we don't hurt big businesses, they have no impact coming off their flow. That's what you can vote on. Start off on their contention 1. They talk about startups. Cross-apply Cunningham, where he says that we don't end all acquisitions, just bad ones that hurt innovation. We can maximize their impact of jobs by benefiting the small companies that would succeed if there weren't killer mergers. On their contention 2 about fintech, this is where they're going to collapse a couple responses. First, it's non-unique. That's because companies like Google are open sourcing their AI and data. That's really important because things like Google HiveMind are already accessible to small businesses. But second, you can turn it. Fuhrer in 2018 finds that things like mobile money services are offering a free way for people, for developing countries to access the services they're talking about. They talk about bank services and things like that. Matheson in 2018 reports that this is already happening right now. There's no reason to vote for them if this continues. The final thing they say is that they're going to scrutinize and get rid of data. Do some strength of link weighing here. They don't give you empirics that this is going to happen. It's never happened. And look back to our observation. We're not going to hurt big tech. As we affirm.
Open for cross?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Can I first question?
Yeah, go for it.
All right, so let's talk about your link chain on your contention, right? So what you're telling us is that affirming gives small companies the power to sue bigger companies?
Absolutely.
Okay, so how does it, when has this ever happened?
In every single case that we give you, I think the Microsoft example is perfect here. Let me answer your question. Hold on. Let me answer your question. The reason that the federal government is so unique, in the Microsoft example, that's one example where the federal government actually enforced. What we're saying is that beyond the federal government, it caused private companies to become emboldened because they knew they could win in court. That's why four other private companies also sued. Things like Sun Microsystems and AOL, all which scaled up and became successful companies they wouldn't have without Microsoft. Can I ask you a question?
You didn't really answer mine. Which companies sued Microsoft and what for?
Which companies? Sun Microsystems, AOL, and I can't remember the other two. Why did they sue them? Because they were having antitrust things like anti-competitive practices put upon them. They couldn't win in court because Microsoft has huge amounts of power. When the federal government gave them the power and the backing to do so, that's when they had the power to sue and get their settlement and succeed. Okay. Can I ask you a question? Mm-hmm. So your whole argument is that data collection means that fintech is like not going to happen, right?
Yeah.
When has ever a court case taken away data from big tech?
It's actually a new development, right? So we tell you in April of this year, the FTC just announced a new task force that is specifically looking at how data collection is creating monopolies in big tech.
All right.
We're telling you that it's happening right now, and that's what the FTC is doing.
That is looking, as you just said, looking at monopolies. Can you
No,
give us a card that says that they're going to
practices.
take away their data?
The FTC literally saying is that when you're using anti-competitive practices, they're going to try and prevent those practices through restricting data. That's the Alexa 73 Reagan case.
Right, so I think that's a little bit of a stretch, right? So like you're saying that big companies are huge and they're monopolies and they're investigating that. But then you're also saying like data might play a role in that maybe, so you're making the link.
It is when you affirm this is what
All right,
happens.
so if
Ask
we
you a question. We've been on this for a minute.
Yeah, we'll come back to it.
Okay, so I want to talk about venture capital, right? So you tell us that these smaller companies are going to sue larger companies, right?
Yes.
But to do that, they have to have the ability to pay for the lawsuit. They have to have the ability to get in the door in the first place, right? You would agree with me that venture capital is the only way that they can have the ability to even get into the jury, get into the courtroom.
We
right?
absolutely agree. The
Right.
thing is, on the reason that we do this is that's why we need the federal government. That's why we need the resolution specifically with the federal government, because the federal government gives them the power to actually sue. You don't necessarily have to have venture capital like we'll contest like your contention there. That's not really the link in. What it is the federal government emboldening these companies. But can we go back to your open source thing? At the point where we show that small companies have the exact same access to data because they have
we're
access
telling
to
you
things
not
like
getting
Census
funded.
Bureau.
These bigger companies have
How's
more
your
infrastructure and
uniqueness?
banks are buying the smaller ones. Big tech is the only way that this innovation that they're doing is actually going to get to market.
Why can't a small company offer these bank services?
No, we're saying that they can. The issue is that banks are trying to suppress their innovation by buying them up, and they don't have the infrastructure in other countries.
Stop buying them up.
Could we see banks are buying them up?
Oh, yeah, let's start right once we get it.
Starting now. Okay, stop there. 14.
How much you guys have left?
Well, we used
Like
18, then
45.
30, then 14. So, however math is, it's like, yeah, a little less than a minute. So we'll say 55.
Okay, sure. We'll be right back.
Okay. Let's see what they go for. Did we explain it? Oh, no. What? Did we explain it? Yes. I'm gonna spend some more time on the reasons for I think that's really important. So, yes. Let's see if they go hard for everything else. Let's go for our interpretation. Let's do more, right? I think we go for the interpretation, you're right, because at the point where we win our case, we win the round. I know. Just say that like that. The point where we win our case, we win the round. I know. Give you the warning for why we bounce back. That's the yeah. They're gonna go nuts on fintech here. I know. They are like things like Google AI are already open source. They're already putting the data. And also, you can extend it. I read this, right? No. You didn't read it, but I didn't. It says it's how you. It's the census data. It says it's like the census data. No, it's about the size. I think it's open source. Fintech has already happened. Okay. Also, they don't dispute the fact that small businesses can do it as well. So the point where we prove that small businesses work, they admit that small business can do it. And that point, well, it's break up. If these companies were proving it up, or if they're not receiving data, they're just supposed to fine. They can keep bringing it up. We just say like no enforcement and stuff. Don't give up data ever.
Are you out? It looked to me like you're.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had 2 seconds, but yeah. For a brief off-time roadmap, we'll be doing overview, big business, small business, financial tech.
So overview on their side of the, just tell me which side of the flow you'll be on, and then signpost from there.
Yeah.
Start on their side of the
Yeah,
flow.
start on their side, our side.
And walk me through it as you go.
Sure. Opponents ready?
Yes.
Partner. Starting on their overview, they've coordinated mishandled this. This is going to create a solvency vacuum on their side. It's in Weiner 1918 that specifically tells you that right now there are multiple ways that the FTC is looking to enforce antitrust regulations. They try to tell you that's the only way that they can solve, or the only way that they're advocating is settlements. That's absolutely not true. FTC through Weiner 19 is specifically saying that they're looking at multiple ways to try to enforce their like antitrust powers. But the issue is that predatory practices, which is like undercutting these small startups, is what is going to continue to happen in the status quo, regardless if you affirm or negate. And that's because of two reasons. They don't respond to either of these. That's terminal defense on their side, right? First is because of our ecosystem, right? The capitalist market that we have right now is what produces this like lack of competition and predatory practices. It's always going to continue. They can't solve back to that. They don't respond to that. But then extend the Westlaw 18 that specifically tells you that centralization still happens in every other industry in which antitrust is enforced. That means that there's a massive solvency deficit. They don't solve for anything. Any risk of a negative impact happening on their side of the flow means that you're going to negate. Then extend Carmen King that specifically says on big business, right? Trickle down lawsuits happen. That happens in other industries. They try to say that federal government is going to sue them, and then they're going to lead to a settlement. That's exactly what we're saying. If antitrust laws get more power, that means the federal government is going to have the ability to try to extend into small startups. We tell you that that's a really bad thing, because small startup companies don't have the resources to fight off the massive lawsuits, nor do they have the resources to settle like Microsoft would. But then, on Roosevelt 17, right, we give you this idea of like Microsoft. Whenever the federal government dealt with the antitrust lawsuit, Microsoft went down in innovation, down in employment, and down in output. They try to say that there were two responses, right? They say once Microsoft bounces back, but then they say two, it hurts the bottom line. Two, like those contradict, right? So like it has to be one or the other. Either investor confidence is hurt, or Microsoft bounces back, right? Okay, so now let's go into our side of the flow on startups. This is really important. They already conceded that startups is a prerequisite to everything. The issue is that whenever you affirm, you take away the initial potential for venture capitals to actually invest in startup technology. That's really important because we're controlling every single link on the flow. That's going to lead us to all of the impacts that they're going to extend later. But then on like financial, on fintech really quickly, look and see the turn.
Okay.
All right, sweet.
All right. Let's start
Start prepping.
Let's look at this right here. You can see this right here. Literally, it's game over for them right now. At the moment, they don't dispute. But they just basically gave up the referendum. What is it here? Even if they have a bit of offense, Cunningham says that 94% aren't killer. They don't respond to that because they're extending through ink. That's ridiculous, right? 94% are killer. The only ones that get are individual companies. What did they say? Google. That's not our response. Also, their jobs are already created. They're the status quo. We're creating new growth. That's the difference. New growth. Yeah, let's start on our jobs. All right, stop there.
Stop.
10 seconds left.
Go slow.
Alright, we'll start on their case, move to ours. Is everyone ready? Okay. Start off by extending Jackson's observation on their case. The point where they dropped us in the last summary, it is game over for the negative because our observation gives you 4 reasons to prefer our interpretation. The first one is that the FTC's website literally says the most common form of enforcement is settlements. The second is the warranting that we give you in case, very clear warranting that isn't contested well at all. We tell you that 1, they want to get more investment, which means that they're going to start to settle before it hurts their bottom line. But second, they want to maintain political influence, so they're not going to be fighting the FTC's regulations. The third is the McAfee evidence, which says that Microsoft's example is going against them because when Microsoft had support from the DOJ litigating against them, private companies felt emboldened and they knew the FTC would uphold court decisions. The fourth is the empiric precedent. There is no empiric precedent on their case. These are 4 reasons that are going to kill the ballot for them. With that, their only little piece of offense is coming off of startups. The problem is they're extending through ink. They don't respond to the Cunningham analysis, which says that only 6% of mergers are illegal ones. Even if you want to give them that little mitigation of impact, do some impact weighing here. Their impact is about creating more tech sector jobs, which are going to the people that are are like graduates from college. Our impact is about putting more money into the economy, which one subsumes their offense. Extend the AI impact here because we put in $13 trillion into the economy. We are a prerequisite to them because their jobs are happening in the status quo. Remember the thesis of our case. We are not hurting big businesses. We are just benefiting small startups. At that point, we subsume the jobs impact and add on $13 trillion to the economy. Let's go to our side of the case. On their little overview, they tell you that the FTC is doing a lot of investigations right now, but the FTC literally says that enforcement is settlements. Even if they're doing things right now with a task force, that doesn't mean that the most common form of enforcement that litigants decide to pursue is going to be going away. That means you can start by extending the investment link, which they also concede to because it goes on their case. They say that lawsuits are not going to be leading to things like investments in startups. That's not true. Lawsuits are the same thing that happened with empirical precedent, but then they also say that it hurts their bottom line, but it's contradictory with them increasing funds. The Microsoft example is really responsive here. It tells you that they had record levels of growth because they bounce back before litigation harms their bottom line. Thus, we affirm.
Are you open for cross?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Can I ask the first question?
Yeah.
Okay. So we tell you, right, in every single speech, that the issue in the system right now is that predatory practices are undercutting these small startup companies, right?
Right, like intimidation,
Right. Like
pricing
stuff that
them
you did
out
on
of
your
the
case
market.
in your first case,
Like
right?
the problem.
Sure.
Right. And then we say that these issues literally cannot get solved because of the system of like capitalism in which competitiveness is continually like the goal.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right, so what
Okay.
we're asking you is,
Okay, can
even
we-
if these companies, these small companies sue the bigger ones and get a little bit of capital, how does that stop the bigger company from still pricing them out of the market?
Okay.
This is like how large they are.
Okay, so like I think there's like a couple of like misconceptions throughout that. So like first of all, the argument that like predatory pricing is always killing small businesses isn't. That's why we read inherency that says that the number one killer of small businesses is that they don't have enough capital. That's why we read the internal link, right? The settlement. Hold on. Hold on. Can we
This is
finish
really
the
important,
response?
right?
Right, so that's where we give access to the internal link, right? Settlements isn't enough money necessarily, but that's why they become a safe haven for investment. That's exactly what happened with Qualcomm after they won the settlement with Apple. They saw their stock prices rise 23%, and they saw a huge influx of capital. That's where the solvency comes from.
Okay, all right, so let me give you an
Could we ask
example.
a question
Yeah.
actually?
Okay, sure, we'll come back.
Okay, so let's talk about startups, right? So you say that like you're going to create more jobs, right? Okay, so these jobs are already being created right now. We can agree on that.
Right, which means that the negative seems to be working.
Sure, totally, for jobs. So if we say that we can not affect this contention will do what it's doing with the rest of the status quo, and we do more on top of it, does that mean that that's not like, that is a reason to negate, right?
Where's the question?
Yeah, the question is, if your impact is status quo, how are you gaining offense off of it if we're not
Because you
changing
change
anything?
the
Because we
status
changed
quo.
the status
How?
quo.
We're not, we're,
Our
we
Venture
are,
capital.
right,
Yeah,
we,
right. So what we tell you, what we extend is the venture capital link, right?
Sure.
So what ends up happening is that like so big companies are no longer be able to acquire like smaller companies, right? And as a result, venture capitalists see this as the runway out for these stall startups so that they can recoup their investments, right? And so at that point, if they no longer see the potential to recoup their investments, they're not going to invest in small startups anymore.
All right,
Which
I
means
think I see the
We've been
issue
on
here.
this for a while though.
Yeah,
Well,
we just have one
Yeah.
more thing. The evidence that we called for, where you talk about VC, I think this has become a little muddled. You're saying that small startups will receive less investment because all of your cards talk about big businesses. They talk about like FANG, the big
yeah,
five tech jump.
Amazon,
Not a
Microsoft,
single
those
one
industries.
talks about
Outside
small
business.
business investment.
But
What-
can we ask the question? We've been on this for a long time.
So
Go
they,
for
Okay,
it.
so let me give you an example of settlements, right? So let's say a small company sues Apple, right? And let's say they get like $1 billion in seed investment because of that that trial, right? You're just agreeing with me, Apple's $1 trillion company. How does that make them being able to, how does that capital prevent them from being priced out of a company that's 1,000 times larger?
Yeah, that's exactly our argument. They're $1 trillion company, which means that $1 billion settlement doesn't do anything to them.
No, but
But what that $1
we're saying
billion
they can still
does
price them
do,
out either way.
that $1 billion does give that small business more incentive for the VC that you talk about. When they have that capital, they become the safe haven, which they're not right now.
Okay. Alright, I'm just gonna go by argument. I'm gonna go overview. I'll answer their stuff. Then I'll go small businesses, then big businesses. I'll be implicating it away. Okay. Is everybody ready?
Wait, start. Which side of the floor are you starting?
Oh, the overview on their side.
Yeah.
Everybody ready? Okay. the overview is going to be really important here. We tell you that the predatory practices that they're talking about in terms of pricing people out of market will exist before and after fiat. In 40 years of empirical analysis, and right now in other industries tells you that antitrust regulations do nothing to stop predatory practices. Insofar as that exists, no amount of capital investment after a lawsuit will help them to prevent these companies from pricing out of market. Insofar as it is completely non-unique, even a 1% risk of the negative means that is a pure vote for negative. But let's go specifically to, they also try and tell you that they're not going to hurt big tech. We tell you there's more than one way to fiat. Like right now they are trying to will go after big tech. That's their intentions. That's completely false. So let's go to startups. We control the internal link to the argument. As they can say the second crossfire, if these companies don't get venture capital in the first place, they won't even be able to sue these larger companies. Insofar as they reduce the potential to be bought out, these venture capitalists won't give them the seed investment they need to get off the ground or even get into the courtroom. That means that there is no settlement. That means that there is no seed investment. That's important because we tell you that 64% of all tech firm jobs come from small startups. And then we also tell you that they are key to innovation. At that point, you're going to be negating. But then, on big businesses, we control the internal link to that as well. Because we tell you that Rosenberg tells you that that these types of lawsuits, even just as a whole, tend to hurt the businesses. Same thing with Microsoft. They try and tell you, oh, they're just going to settle. But we tell you that settlement, the lawsuit itself, being scrutinized by the government itself, hurts investor trust. That's important because we tell you that big businesses are necessary to control the internal link of small businesses. This community tells you that these big businesses are essential to making sure these small startups don't come out too early. And then we also tell you that they're important to invest in these companies. At the end of the day, Nats19 quantifies this when they tell you that big businesses innovate 13% more and invest more. At the end of the day, insofar as you're going to big businesses and small businesses alike, you're going to be voting negative. Because insofar as they don't solve predatory pricing in either world, any 1% chance means that you vote negative. Vote for startups, vote for big businesses.
We have hold on. We have 10 seconds, real quick.
All right. Everyone ready? It's going to start off on the neg, so their case, and then flip over to the app. Okay. All right. Start off on our observation. At the point where we win our case, we win this round. We tell you that we're a prerequisite because of the warranting that we give. If settlements happen, they are empirically proven to not hurt big companies. At the point where we win that, we win this debate. Their only tiny bit of offense here is on acquisitions, but extend the impact weighting that they don't respond to from Aruna and the Cunningham in 2018 card. It says that they only end 6% of mergers, so at best, there's a 6% solvency on their side. That's really important because our offense gives us 100% solvency for the $13 trillion being added to the economy. This impact weighting can seal your ballot right now. That's really critical. But go on to our side. There's a couple of reasons that you're going to be voting on scale-ups. They really extend two things. The first thing is they talk about this historical pattern about how predatory price practices wouldn't win. We've been repeating the same thing over and over again. It isn't predatory prices that kill big businesses, it's a lack of capital. This is empirically proven. Despite predatory prices by Apple, Qualcomm still scaled up and succeeded. Their stock value rose 23%. You can also cross-apply this to their case. They say that VC would go down, but Qualcomm still, their stock rose 23%. We would argue that what actually happens in the real world does not support their case at all. We've been saying this from day one. This is not a hard decision. Then their other response, they really go back to this idea of venture capital. Remember that the empirics are not on their side on this. Look to the Microsoft example that Arunov extends in his speech. It tells you that Microsoft decided to settle the case after learning from their past mistakes. Not only were they able to bounce back and are right now a tech giant, but also they had 4 separate private litigation suits that all spawned new companies. That's been our entire case. Look to what history has shown us. We know for a fact that their case doesn't happen because it has never happened. Then you can get that gives us access not only to the Swift in 19, that's our internal link that says that investment will increase in these small businesses, but it gives us access to the impact of AI. Small businesses are crucial to AI, and the Global Institute in 2018 says that can contribute $13 trillion to the economy. That's jobs and everything else. Keep in mind that we don't take away from their jobs, we only add to the things that exist, thus we affirm.